My name is Joseph Reid, and my book is False Horizon. False Horizon is the second book in the Seth Walker series. It takes Seth to rural West Virginia where a plane crash has happened, and he's got to investigate who might be behind it. And there's no shortage of suspects. There's ecoterrorists, there's drug dealers, there's angry miners and frackers, and he's got to get to the middle of who might have caused this tragic event.
Book lovers unite! I'm Demethius Jackson, and you're listening to the Chapter 1 podcast. The greatest stories ever written all begin with Chapter 1. In each episode, our guest authors will share their first chapters with you. Hey, everybody. On today's episode, we're going to be speaking with Joseph Reid. He writes crime stories that takes place in the air. How's that for a hook? He has a fascinating background and an amazing story that he's sharing with us today entitled False Horizon, which is book 2 of the Seth Walker's Air Marshal series. So buckle up for this one because it's quite a thriller, and it starts right now.
Yeager Airport, Charleston, West Virginia, October 11th. Unlike the other passengers, Joseph Boswell Simpson didn't press forward to the waist-high gate, separating them from the tarmac. The fenced-in patch of damp concrete outside the terminal door reminded him of a livestock pen, and he knew from his childhood what happened to animals that got taken out the chute. Instead, the 26-year-old leaned a shoulder against the exterior wall of the building. There, shrouded in the pre-dawn darkness, he hung his head and wondered exactly how big a mistake he was about to make. Judging by the acid scalding his throat, Boz, everyone around St. Albans called him Boz, figured it was pretty huge. Bigger than the things he'd been keeping quiet about for the last 3 years. Bigger even than the lies he'd been telling his wife that whole time. The latest one of those had come at bedtime the previous night, when Delilah had noticed him shaking. But it wasn't the 50-minute airplane flight that had him spooked, not really. While he preferred the outdoors to confined spaces, he'd flown successfully 4 times in his life. Twice as a kid, on those rare occasions when his father had enjoyed a good enough year that the family could afford a few days at Disney World. Once more, 2 years back for their honeymoon in the Bahamas. And then, of course, 3 weeks ago. This very same route to Pittsburgh. That was the trip that had made a mess of things. Left him wondering now whether he'd make it onto his late morning return flight. Or, if he did, whether anything would ever be the same. Why, Boz wondered, hadn't he insisted on making the 4-hour drive? Sure, the internet company had offered to pay for the flight, but he could have turned them down. He could have told them he was scared of heights, or that little puddle jumper planes were the worst for the environment. He'd read that somewhere. Hell, anything to avoid taking that flight. But he had taken it, and now, here he was. Boz squeezed his eyes shut. He thought of his wife, the way she'd lain sleeping when he'd left. Peaceful, hair swept back like she'd brushed it that way. On her side, an extra pillow clutched between her knees to relieve the stress on her back, now that the little peanut was starting to show. From the day he'd met her, Delilah Marie Richards had always been way too good for him. He knew that. Everyone in the whole damn county knew it. Which was exactly why you took that flight, to earn her. Boz stopped the voice in his head before the lie spun out too far. He'd lied enough already. Truth was, he hadn't traveled to Pittsburgh for Delilah. Not when it came to taking the flight, anyway. The job, the extra money, sure. The chance to maybe move somewhere nice? Absolutely. The chance to get free from Chaz Miller? Most of all. But not that flight. That flight had been all about him. As he'd parked the truck that morning and cleared security, as he'd stopped to buy a cup of coffee near the gate, he'd been play acting, pretending he was someone important, someone who had a plane to catch. God, it had felt glorious. So good that Boz had forgotten Caitlin Stallings worked the register at the Connaught Cafe inside the terminal. A tiny young woman with loud freckles painted across her arms and forehead, Caitlin was Chaz's second cousin on his mother's side. That was one thing about Chaz. He had so many cousins spread across the county, You never knew where you might run into one. And whenever you did, Chaz would know exactly where you'd been and exactly what you'd been doing. This morning, Boz had bypassed the cafe. He didn't need to see Caitlin again, and he didn't want any coffee. He'd briefly considered slamming down something stronger on the drive to the airport, but decided against it. His stomach was already wrecked, and it'd be just his luck to get pulled over, or worse, to run into some other Chaz cousin who'd snitch on him too. The airline agent emerged from the building, wove through the crowd, and unhitched the latch on the metal gate. Passengers flooded from the pen, dragging their rolling suitcases down the cross-hatched path to the plane. Boz pushed himself up off the wall and ambled after them. Off to the right, daylight was breaking. From the damp ground and the way the horizon softened at the first hint of sunrise, he guessed the low-lying clouds would hang around all day. That was the kind of local knowledge the internet people in Pittsburgh had said they wanted as a boost for their fishing app. Getting paid for stuff he already knew sounded like easy money to Boz, who'd never had very much. Of course, that's how he'd been consoling himself since he'd gotten involved with Chaz in the first place. And the money had come in handy. At first, all he'd needed was a couple of $1,000 to pay off Delilah's engagement ring and make sure they had enough for the wedding. Now, with a little one on the way, Boz ignored the luggage cart parked at the base of the stairs to the plane. The whole idea behind the backpack was that he could keep it with him. After clambering up and ducking through the door, he shuffled down the narrow aisle to his seat, the window on row 4. He tucked the bag at his feet, clipped the two ends of his seatbelt together, and yanked the loose end until it was snug. Once more, Boz found his hand shaking. Lying again, he blamed the cold and his shitty canvas coat. Crossing his arms tightly against his chest, he forced his eyes shut and summoned the warmest thought he could, the sun in the Bahamas. He'd never felt anything that blazing hot. So intense, it seemed to generate its own physical pressure, pushing on you, squeezing you, making it difficult to breathe. God, breathing felt hard now, too. Boz inhaled sharply through his nose, then swallowed over the lump in his throat. When he glanced up front, the flight attendant was pulling the stairs up into the cabin. Once they were stowed, she closed and sealed the front door with a heavy clunk. He instinctively turned to the window. Outside the small circle of plexiglass, the engine roared to life. Louder than a chainsaw, but lower pitched, it nearly drowned out the pre-recorded safety announcements that played over the PA system. Beyond the now spinning propeller, the sky had lightened to a dull gray that matched the underside of the wing. After a few minutes, the scenery shifted as the plane began to taxi. Their roll down the runway took less than 45 seconds. As they cleared the edge of the airfield, Boz watched the terrain drop several hundred feet down to the brown water of the river, the incline making their climb seem even steeper and more dramatic. After leveling off, the small plane banked gently, turning northeast and gaining altitude. In the dim light, the wooded hills below appeared charcoal black. Narrow plumes of silver mist rose from the ground, adding to the impression that some sort of massive fire had thoroughly scorched the earth and then been doused. Contrary to the apocalyptic look of things, though, Boz knew the landscape below was thriving, a dense patch of rural wilderness, virtually identical to the one west of here, where he'd first met Chaz Miller 3 years ago. It had been spring then, the woods teeming with does and their new, spindly-legged fawns, when Chaz had arrived at the store with another guy, looking for a turkey hunting guide. Although they carried rifles, the pair hadn't been dressed like any kind of hunters Boz had ever seen. No camo, no gear, just t-shirts and jeans, like they were headed to the movies instead of into the forest. Boz had immediately recognized Chaz's face. Everyone in the county knew him, whether they bought from him or not. Given Chaz's reputation, Boz decided he should keep quiet and be polite. It hadn't helped. They hadn't been hunting for 10 minutes when Chaz started asking questions. Which direction the river flowed, which way the interstate was. Whenever they came across a game trail, Chaz or his buddy would ask its length and where it led. Boz did his best to answer in the fewest possible words, hoping Chaz might think he was slow and end the trip early. It didn't happen. The pair kept him out until the hunting day officially ended after lunchtime, and the two never did shoot anything except a couple of old stumps, whooping and hollering as they splintered the rotten wood. When he dropped Chaz and his partner back at their car, Boz had sighed with relief, until they'd returned to the shop 2 weeks later. Upon being told they could choose their guide, Chaz strode over, wrapped an arm around Boz's shoulders, and proclaimed, "This here's my guy." Once again, Boz had kept his mouth shut on their drive out to the woods. After they'd stalked several hundred yards into the forest, though, Chaz started talking about how he was willing to pay for loyal help and all the good things he'd heard about Boz. Chaz had produced a stack of bills as thick as a deck of playing cards. After stripping off $300 bills, he'd shoved them into the breast pocket of Boz's flannel. Even as he'd stood motionless, Boz couldn't help but notice that Chaz's partner had his rifle up and ready. And that was how Boz had come to work for the most powerful drug dealer in Kanawha County. Mostly, he'd done simple stuff, showing them trails, guiding them through the forest. The few times he'd actually seen any drugs, it was just shrink-wrapped packages of weed. From what Boz had heard on TV, states were legalizing pot, so where really was the harm in that? Thinking back to it now, Boz ground his teeth. He squeezed the tip of the armrest between his fingers and palm, as if he might peel the plastic strip back off the metal. He'd hoped the interview in Pittsburgh would be his ticket out, would save him and Delilah and the baby from all the dumb decisions he'd made. He'd never thought it would lead to more trouble, more lies, or to this flight. Because while Boz didn't know exactly what was waiting in the bag he was supposed to retrieve for Chaz in Pittsburgh, he knew it wouldn't be pot. Pushing back against the headrest, Boz reclined the seat the few inches it would go and forced his eyes shut. He told himself all this would be over before noon. He could pick up Delilah and take her out for lunch. She was craving meat these days, maybe a burger at Dwight's. They both deserved that. Or at least, she did. As the engine droned on, Boz took several deep breaths through his nose. The heater had finally kicked in, overdoing it, so now the cabin felt warm and stuffy. His muscles finally relaxed, and when they did, the blackness seemed to spread from his eyelids to the rest of him. A sudden jolt and loud noise got Boz's attention. As he was thrown forward, his eyes flicked open. He didn't know if he'd dozed off. If so, he wasn't asleep anymore. His first thought was turbulence. He'd experienced that once before. But this hadn't been any little bounce. The impact made it seem more like a car crash. Thankfully, he'd had his belt on tight. Whatever happened had changed the plane's momentum. Rather than continuing straight, it was angled up and to the side, as if banking into a steep turn. But the turn didn't end. Instead, the airplane continued listing, eventually tipping all the way over onto its side. Boz glanced quickly to his right, now the equivalent of down, and then to his left. He blinked twice. Outside, the sky had turned a brilliant blue. They must have risen above the cloud cover, up where the sun was shining. But as his eyes struggled to adjust to the light, he sensed that the view out the window was too bright, almost blinding. That seemed wrong somehow. For the first time, Boz also noticed the sound, or lack of it. The cabin was much quieter than before, eerily so. When his eyes finally focused on the world beyond the window, he understood why. The engine was missing, and, along with it, most of the wing. The front of the plane began tilting downward now, as if starting a dive. Boz felt almost weightless for a moment, until the seat pressed into his back and pushed him along. In addition, the window seemed to drop away from him, while the other side of the plane began to rise. Boz wondered what exactly was happening, until he realized they were starting to spin. Slowly at first, then faster. The airplane ended up taking 3 full minutes to drop all the way to Earth. During those 180 seconds, the plane spun until the second wing gave way and ripped off. Completely deprived of power, the cabin lights went out. Without the rotation bleeding off speed, the fuselage accelerated until it reached terminal velocity. Luggage and other items flew through the cabin. In the dark, people cried and screamed and prayed. Boz didn't notice any of it. He thought about Delilah the whole way down.
So False Horizon is actually your second installment of the Seth Walker series, correct?
It is. It is. The first book was called Takeoff, and that came out last year.
Okay. Is this a continuation of your previous book, or is this a standalone story?
It is a sequel in the sense that it's a standalone story, but it picks up shortly after the end of Takeoff.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the characters are the same and things like that.
I understand. So this is just basically the next major thing that happens in Seth's life.
Exactly.
Well, starting the book off, not only with a plane crash, but told from the perspective of Boz, this mysterious passenger, was a great idea. I've actually been in a situation similar. I remember I was flying to Chicago and I was over Lake Michigan. And, they call it the Windy City for a reason, right? We have all this turbulence going on, and the turbulence I'm okay with. I'm used to that. But all of a sudden, the plane just took this extreme nosedive, and all I hear is this like a P-47 Thunderbolt from World War II or whatever. Like, we're nosediving here. And the only thing that I really remember is crouching into my seat, and I couldn't lift my neck because the force of gravity was that strong. And I was like, oh my God, I think this is it. I think that we're going down. And then out of nowhere, the plane levels off, everything goes back to normal, and no one says anything about it. Not even an announcement.
Oh, really?
No. Wow. Yeah. So I guess that's just what happens when you fly to Chicago, at least from the direction of DC.
Well, I've had some missed approaches, where you fly in and it's at night and the pilot comes down and you think you're going to land, and then all of a sudden at the last minute he sort of powers up and you essentially take off again.
Mm-hmm.
I've had those happen, and those can be a little scary because you're wondering sort of if you're going to make it down, and then if they have to divert, you start thinking about how much gas do they have and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I fly a lot for work. My day job as a lawyer keeps me flying around the U.S. and around the world. So I think I added up once. I think I've flown a couple of million miles.
That's incredible. When did the character of Seth Walker come to you? Was it on a flight, or was it in a dream, or was it something random?
Yeah, it was a little more random than that. I had started originally, the very first book I wanted to write was a spy book, like a big sprawling international spy adventure across 17 time zones.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat down and I tried to write that one a lot, and it didn't really go anywhere. And gradually I kind of realized that I wasn't ready to write that book. And so I decided I needed to write a practice book first. And so I started thinking, something smaller, something more local. And, so many authors specialize on a particular place, like John Sanford does Minnesota and the Twin Cities.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm enough of a nomad that as I started to think about, well, what's my place? What place do I write about? Airports and airplanes kind of jumped to my mind. And that sort of, then spiraled off from there about, all the different kinds of adventures you can have around aviation. And then, well, who would be there, right? And who would be an action hero in that setting? And so that's kind of how the character of Seth got started.
Okay. And, at first glance, Walker seems like the typical tough guy, seasoned officer, but then it doesn't really take long to realize that maybe he's in a bit over his head with this case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's certainly the plan. So
I'm wondering, with your own background, are you pulling from any of that for your influences?
I mean, there's certainly little nuggets of stuff. So, for example, a lot of people have asked why I set it in West Virginia. And I've spent a lot of time in West Virginia. I spent a year there when I was growing up. I've been there a decent bit, and I felt like I had a decent handle on West Virginia. My books tend to have a decent bit of technology in them. And so that I kind of draw out of my day job as a patent lawyer, because I'm exposed to a decent amount of technology, and I'm forced to keep current on what's happening with things. It's not giving anything away to say that the cover of the book has a drone on it. And so, drones feature pretty prominently in the book, and that was some tech research I needed to do. So I pull threads like that, but beyond that, yeah, it's a what if scenario where you try and think of an inciting incident like this plane crash, and then where it might go from there.
Yeah, yeah. And I understand West Virginia. Wild and wonderful, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I am no stranger to that 81 into Martinsburg, let me tell you. And as a patent lawyer, as you mentioned, you're always used to working with these super complex cases and issues. And I heard actually that you often use fiction as a way to help others understand or simplify. Is that how you became interested in writing books in general?
A little bit. In my cases, I have to sort of simplify technology for either the judge or the jury or whoever I'm presenting it to. So I do a lot of writing and a lot of tech writing in my day job. The desire to write fiction really was, sort of born out of just being a lifelong reader. I read a lot in the thriller and mystery genre. And, I eventually just got to a point where I was sort of wondering, okay, I know I'm a pretty good writer in general, right? But could I do something like that? Could I scratch that itch and do, the kinds of books that I like to read? And so it was really sort of a lark and a thought experiment at first, just to see if I could try it.
So switching gears back to the story, we got a good glimpse of who Boz was, but who's Seth? Can you give us a little bit about his background?
Sure. Seth is currently an air marshal, or actually what you discover when you read the books is he was an air marshal about 5 minutes ago. Something happened that caused his covert status to get pierced. And so now he's stuck as essentially an investigator investigating aviation-based crimes. Before that, he had a prior life as an electrical engineer. He was at a big electronics company in Texas, designing things that you'd see like computers and DVD players and Blu-ray players and things like that. And so as we learn a little bit more about him in Takeoff and in this book, we get into some questions about why he might have left his former life, what might have caused him to make such a radical switch, and whether he's cut out for this new life that he's got of solving crimes.
So it kind of puts me in the mindset of that scene from Godfather 3 where Al Pacino is like, just when I thought I was out, you pull me right back in.
Yeah. The idea, I think, is that although he doesn't really want to, the cases that he investigates naturally sort of poke at the reasons why he's here and the reasons why he left his old life. And that there are all kinds of things he can't run away from, even though he's desperately trying to do so.
And also, this story takes place in a number of different cities as well. I think it starts off with Seth in D.C.
Yeah, he lives in L.A., and so then he goes to D.C. And starts there before he goes out to West Virginia, where the plane crashes occurred.
So, with the complexities of the stories and the technology within them, has it become easier to write Seth Walker books, or?
I'd say it's about the same. When I sat down and I came up with Seth, I sort of envisioned, a few different adventures for him. And I did try to think about where all of this would take him. And so, to this point, I mean, there have been surprises along the way. I certainly didn't know when I started, for example, that this book was going to be about drones so much. Some of that stuff is sort of spontaneous, but writing Seth and sort of where the overall journey is taking him is something that I'd thought through pretty early.
How did you decide to incorporate drones into the story?
One of the very first, groups of suspects we encounter here are these ecoterrorists who are sort of rampaging across West Virginia protesting fracking. And so when you start, asking, well, how would they do that? And if they're trying to disrupt these fracking sites where all these sort of heavily armed minor chemical worker people are, how are they going to do that? And that's I think probably where the drone idea first came in.
I figured it had to be something significant since, the drones are actually on the cover of the book.
Yes.
The other question I had about that is False Horizon. That's a pretty interesting title. Is there a meaning within it?
Yeah. So False Horizon is actually the name of an optical illusion that pilots suffer from sometimes if they're flying through cloud banks and the cloud banks are stacked in a certain way. It can look to the pilot like the horizon is in a place where it actually is not.
Mm-hmm.
And so the pilot can end up either, flying too high or flying too low and not really understanding where he is relative to the earth. And in the story here, too, Seth is really, for a variety of reasons, disoriented with respect to what's going on and who might be, doing the bad things here. And so, that was kind of the double meaning I wanted to play with.
So what's next for you? I'm guessing more Seth books.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in the middle of a little bit of a tour for False Horizon. We've had a couple of events and we've got a few more coming up on the schedule. And then, I'm in terms of writing, I'm in the middle of book 3, the next in the Seth Walker series. It's called Departure, and it'll be out, if all goes well, next year.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can readers go online to learn more about you and your books?
Sure. My website is Joseph Reid Books, and my last name is Reid. So josephreidbooks.com. And from there, you can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all those things. Joseph Reid Books is sort of always my handle. So you can find me on any of those platforms.
And with that, we're going to wrap up another episode. Thanks again to Joe Reid for speaking with us today. If you have a question or comment for him or for me, or an author who you think would be a good fit for the show, let me know. Connect with me on social media. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or you can send an email to info@ch1podcast.com. Check out our website at ch1podcast.com, where there you can listen to previous episodes and hopefully find your next favorite author. Subscribe to us on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, everywhere podcasts can be downloaded. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review, but most importantly, tell everyone you know about the show, because that is how we grow. And a special thanks to you all for listening to us each episode. Once again, that's it for me. You all stay awesome. Till next time.